For the summer reading and writing class, the books that we'll be reading are Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin and The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Hatt. In both cases, I have PDF versions of those books, and I know that it may be difficult to get a copy of physical books right now, so in the case where it's not possible to get a copy, then we can use the PDF, and the students are more than welcome to use the PDF if they'd like, but if they'd like to get a physical copy of the book, that's also totally fine. We'll be using the PDFs in class for when we do reading out loud, and when we do in discussion, I will be referencing the PDF versions, but some students prefer the physical copies, and I myself prefer the physical copy, so if they want to use the physical copy, that's totally fine. But PDFs will be available. Wizard of Earthsea is a classic fantasy novel about, it's a classic high fantasy novel, but it includes some real literary merit. It is not just a young adult adventure novel with power fantasies and things like that. It has some major themes and life lessons that I find are extremely useful for helping students understand their own motivations and their own strengths and weaknesses, and figuring out how to handle their ambitions and the consequences of their actions. Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime is a very unique novel that I use to discuss logic and reasoning and paying attention to the world around you. It's told from the first person perspective of a boy with severe autism, so it presents a reading challenge as well as a challenge for active reading, so that students will need to engage and think about what's not being said and what's being implied, rather than simply absorbing information as it comes through. Generally, I find that most students haven't read either of these books, although there are some schools that have Curious Incident in their curriculum. If the case is that a large number of students have read that book, well, I'll choose another one, probably Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I find that both of these novels present a vocabulary challenge and a literary challenge to students in middle school years. So these are usually right where I like them to be. They are not too challenging that students can't understand it, but they are just challenging enough that students will be engaged and enjoy them, and also improve their vocabulary and reading comprehension as they do so. Homework every day requires 3 components. There's going to be the reading requirement, the note-taking requirement, and the writing requirement. Reading will generally take about an hour, and the note-taking should take about 30 minutes or less, and then the writing assignment will take probably another 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the student's ability and the actual assignment. I try to limit the anticipated reading and writing requirements together to be not more than 2 hours. As the class goes on and students become familiar with my note-taking system, the note-taking becomes fairly minimal, because it's more a matter of them stopping to consider what they've read and be prepared for class. So the note-taking component eventually is fairly minimal as students become more familiar with it. It is a regular system that they should be able to master with no difficulty. I try to keep the writing assignments to 30 minutes at maximum. And in a similar way, the writing assignments, once students are familiar with my requirements and what I'm looking for in my paragraphs and my responses, they should be more comfortable and more familiar, and their ability to answer prompts and respond to assignments should improve. And so the homework requirement will reduce there as well. The difference between passive reading and active reading is very important. What can often happen for students in school is, with the amount of work that they have to do and with the lack of individual focus, students will treat reading as a chore that needs to be accomplished without actually engaging in the work necessary to gain the benefits of reading literature in the first place. There's certainly fun to be had in reading something for fun, just to enjoy it. So there's not zero benefit gained from passive reading. But when it comes to literature and academic reading, students need to learn how to actually see what the meaning of the words is, to see what the intention is behind what the author has done. So when students are given an assignment for class, they see it as a check mark to be checked. So they power through their assignment. They read it quickly. They don't retain it. They don't analyze it. They regurgitate plot. They say that they talk about characters as though they're real people. They don't care because they don't see the relevance. It's a fictional character. It's not a real character. It's the same problem with history in that regard. So what I try to do is focus on the active reading component. I have a system that I call Spicy, which is an unfortunate name, but that's how the acronym worked out. It's setting, plot, and character, style, point of view, and context. And when students learn how to identify these components in a story, they kind of almost automatically learn how to do active reading more effectively by keeping track of these things and taking notes on these things and discussing how the author uses these choices, the choices made in terms of setting and plot and character and style and etc. When students are aware of these choices being made and why they're significant, then they automatically engage in active reading. And they can apply Spicy to not only texts like literature, but also to any work of art or even advertisements. And so my goal as an instructor is to help students engage in not only active reading, but active engagement with the world around them. And so rather than simply absorb information without processing it, they will engage with information and glean its meaning through their own interpretation, which I find to be a very important skill to survive in the world today, especially considering the amount of information that gets thrown at us on any given day. One of the biggest problems that students have is a lack of confidence. And the lack of confidence comes from the fact that many teachers and many adults, many people simply understand writing as something everybody can do. If you can speak, you can write. But the fact is that writing involves a lot of rules that are not immediately understandable. The writing involves strategies and tactics and organizational skills that not every student picks up naturally. And if a student is more of a passive reader and simply absorbing text, they don't have a system in their mind for how to build sentences properly, how to build paragraphs properly, how to construct meaning in a real logical way using writing. So what I teach is the system of rhetoric and the system of writing necessary for students to gain confidence in their own abilities to communicate their own ideas. I have systems for students to construct topic sentences and theses to make sure that they're rhetorically addressing what they're reading and what they're responding to, point out grammatical and logical connections between questions and answers, and to construct paragraphs in ways that convey meaning clearly and important. One thing I teach students is that meaning is not truly found in the sentence, but that meaning is really gained through the paragraph. And when students are less afraid to write paragraphs, then they're much less afraid to write in general. So start with confidence in constructing a sentence, especially a topic sentence, then work to constructing a paragraph. And then once the paragraph is perfected, then we work to constructing a perfect essay. Vocabulary is one of the hardest things for students to learn, especially with English as a second language, or if English isn't their first or even second language. Vocabulary can be studied in multiple ways, and it varies from student to student. A lot of people think that vocabulary has to be studied through memorization and just cramming words into your brain with flashcards. For some people, that works very well. But the thing about vocabulary words and the thing about words in general is that they require context. So if you are only memorizing words outside of context, you still have to learn the context when they're used to discern the connotation and their relationship to other words and how one word is different than another. So I have a two-method system. I have my system of the book that I've written on my vocabulary compilation and active reading. So the vocabulary book organizes words according to meaning rather than through their individual definitions, so that the group of words is connected to one another. They all share a similar meaning, so you can discuss the different connotations and kind of memorize them all at once. And then in terms of regular vocabulary building and building context, the reading books that are slightly more difficult than you can handle is the best way to improve your vocabulary. It's better even than memorizing things. So there is a memorizing component to study, and then there is the use component of study, which comes through reading. One thing I like to remind my students who are international students and who are English as a foreign language students, or even just students who don't have a lot of experience with reading or they don't enjoy reading, is to remember that native speaking students are also building their vocabulary at this time. So I think a lot of international students think that they're failing in some way or native speakers have an advantage. And of course, there is a certain advantage to being a native speaker. But just because you can speak a language doesn't mean that you can read and write it. Global illiteracy rates show that that's the case. And language existed for thousands of years before writing did. So students in middle years are building their vocabularies in the same way if they're a native speaker or an international speaker. So that's an important thing to remember, and I try to remind students of that. Yes, that's great. I'd love to give you an example. I think Janet has the word families for arrogant and boastful that she's going to show, to the words that are all related to those concepts. This vocabulary book was compiled using SAT vocabulary words that were used over 30 years of the test. They've changed the test since 2015, but I find that these vocabulary words still work well and still hold up in their relevance to their use on the SAT. Everything is organized according to the frequency with which it showed up on SAT tests and the frequency with which it showed up in SAT passages. So the higher level words are the most common, the most necessary, and the lower level words are still in the family of the meaning, but they are less frequently used. So in this case, like the level 1 words showed up a lot, and so students should know what they mean. The level 2 are less common, certainly less common than level 3 they mean the same thing, but they never showed up on the SAT. The more stars that it has, the more valuable it is in terms of the SAT, but in my experience, it also means the more valuable it is as something to learn to improve comprehension of difficult texts. My classes are formatted primarily around interactions and discussions. I like to do group work. I like to have students working together on creative projects. We will have a debate in every class, just not a debate in the traditional format, but a discussion and back and forth about what the meaning of the text is and how students can apply the lessons from the text in their daily lives. And we'll often have in-group creative writing assignments related to the topics and themes that are in the novel in order to develop the skills that I feel are associated with each novel. For Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, it's about observation and logic. And for Wizard of Earthsea, it's about self-reflection and balance. As for the second question, online classes can be really tricky. I've got, at this point, 5 to 6 years of online teaching experience, and I've learned how to deal with students being distracted and students not paying attention, students being distracted by the internet. I make sure that students are engaged in discussion. I use open-ended questions. I require feedback. I require students to work together to solve problems, and they have to have input. They're not going to just be passively sitting and listening to me lecture the whole time. I do have a tendency to lecture occasionally, but for the most part, my focus is on student participation and student production, student activity, student skill development. So when necessary, I will be there lecturing, but for the most part, students will always be engaged and always be participating, so it won't be a problem. Thanks, everybody. As always, I'm super happy to be able to connect with learning community and be able to share the curriculum with everyone. So I look forward to working with you. Have a great day.